Well,
$1 million question.
I mean, the code that you highlight there, we only found out about that. The government was only forced to even bother to rush out this code. One, because of the documents released by Ed. And then a year later, when we at PI sued GCHQ, we said, we don't think you've got any legal authority to conduct these kind of hacking activities. We looked through the statute books, we flicked through, and we tried to find the bit that talked about government hacking. We tried to find the bit that said that they could remotely switch on the microphone on your mobile phone, that they could activate the webcam and to take photographs of you. And we couldn't find it. So we took this case last year, and two things have happened in this last year. The first is that the government have introduced this draft code of practice. They've called it equipment interference because they don't like talking about hacking. Hacking is something that the bad guys do. What they do is they interfere with equipment. Very, very different. Same way they don't do mass surveillance, they do bulk interception. Radically different. Radically different. So that's the first thing that they've done. And they've introduced this not as primary legislation, not something that our parliament gets to properly debate. Instead, they introduced it as a code of practice, an add-on to the legislation, as it were. And the second thing that they did, which we only found out about 2 weeks ago now, is that we have a law that criminalizes unlawful hacking. So if you want to come and hack me now, that's an offense, right? You can't do that. The same law applied to GCHQ. If they want to come hack me, they were not allowed to do so. And this was our case. We said, look, you're breaking the law. You don't have any authority to do it. And second of all, you're committing a criminal offense in doing it anyway. So we thought we were on pretty solid ground. Until a day before court, the day before, we get notified by the government that they've changed the law. The Computer Misuse Act, the thing that criminalizes their activity, had been amended. They'd snuck it into the Serious Crime Bill. In the explanatory notes of the legislation, they make no reference to it. The parliamentary debate doesn't talk about it because no one knew that this was the implication of the change. So we're fighting a really, really long fight here. Even when we're taking them to court, you know, they're moving the goalposts pretty quickly. But you know, we shouldn't be disheartened by this. To me, this is a sign that we're now having an opportunity to do something about this. You know, 2 years ago, we couldn't have even talked about it. It's taken Ed to blow the whistle here. It's taken our courts to begin to bite on it. It's moved our parliament to try and consider this. And now we've got this new legislation, the Investigatory Powers Bill. They're saying they need more powers. They say they don't have enough of our data. I mean, Ed, as someone who's looked through our data, what do you think? Do you think they've got enough?
So I had used systems mass surveillance personally. I was an NSA analyst in Hawaii who had access to a system called X-Keyscore, which is basically where all the products of mass surveillance that are related to, for example, computer-to-computer communications, everything you do on the internet, everything you type into a search engine, every email you send. X-Keyscore is where it ultimately gets sort of filed into so people can run their hands through it. And as I'm running my hands through this every day, the way it works is you've got basically a buffer of internet communications, sites to site around the world that are at telecommunications providers. When you send an email to your mother, you don't send it over a line that you own. You know, you don't have a cable running from your house to her house. So it has to go through somebody else's infrastructure. And the problem is governments realized that this was a massive vulnerability for everybody in society, where they could go, you know, we're having trouble understanding what people are doing, and we'd like to know what they're doing. You know, we'd like to know what everybody is doing all the time. Is there anything we can do about that? And they found out that it would be really difficult to listen to everybody's phone calls, to read everybody's emails with human eyes and human ears. So what they did was they went about devising a program, algorithms, computer systems that could do this for them procedurally, automatically. And the global sort of surveillance system that we have today is the system of this. And what's interesting is even the systems that are operating in the United Kingdom are often designed by the national security of the United States. So you're getting US spy equipment put in your country, and your government simply trusts the NSA to give them something that doesn't have a backdoor, that they won't abuse, that they won't use against the United Kingdom, for example. But even if they didn't, when you think about all of those things that are going over those lines all the time, it's not just you writing to your mother, it's not just you calling your therapist, it's not just you sending a text message to the person that you love or you sleep with. It's everything about everybody. And the government would argue that, well, because they're not listening to your phone call, they're simply intercepting it, they're making a record of it, they're making a note of everything that you're doing during the day, who you call, for how long you called them, where you traveled, what cell phone tower that your cell phone handset was connected to at your office, when you were sitting in your driveway, when you were sitting on the bus. All of this stuff is harmless. There was an argument that would say it's just metadata. But we know that's not the case because the director of the National Security Agency, former director, said we kill people based on metadata. And he's right. That's how we target our drone strikes. We don't have somebody on the ground looking at whoever we're shooting at. Rather, we fire at a cell phone that sent a text message or something like that that we don't like, that we assume is held by somebody else. The problem is that cell phone may have been held by a bad guy a week ago, a day ago, a month ago, a year ago, but then they could have given it to their child, they could have given it to their neighbor, they could have left it in town when they went somewhere else, because these are poor areas where they typically share things like that. And further on the metadata thing, a key point is people go, well, metadata by itself is harmless, it doesn't say that much, even though we use it for bad things. But the top lawyer of the National Security Agency, a man named Stuart Baker, said, metadata tells you absolutely everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't need enough content. And he's absolutely right. The way this works is that metadata is a proxy for content. You can reconstruct the activities of someone's life simply from the signaling events, when you call, where you go, what you do. And it's important when we've been, it's been 2 years, people don't really have a good understanding of what exactly was revealed. There were so many stories in the newspaper that were so complex that people didn't really understand what it all meant. And we had things that were easier to understand. For example, like the Prism thing, which is where all of the corporate logos on the top there that you see, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, all of these guys, they began working for the government rather than working for their customers, and providing not just the metadata of your communications, but the content as well, what you actually sent in email. But again, what does that mean when they have it all? And the answer is that it gives the government a window into anybody's life at any given time. It allows them to do what's called pattern of life analysis. And this can be driven by an individual sitting at a desk like myself, or I can simply queue up inquiries, sort of continuing queries that look for anybody's activities who match a certain profile. Anybody who holds certain political views, anybody who associates with given activist groups. And what's interesting is that we see that the government isn't simply watching what we would consider violent radicals, jihadists, Islamists, things like that, who are known to be associated with violence. It can simply be people whose views they think are too extreme, or they're not moderate enough, or even issues that they can't predict may become radicalizers in the future, such as climate change. So the question is, do we really want the government watching everybody all the time? And I would say, even if you think there is some benefit there in terms of intelligence gathering, in terms of surveillance, watching our adversaries, you have to remember the fact that we have a proven history now that these programs are not effective in the United States. We're a little bit ahead of the game because we've had this. We've had the Boston Marathon bombings, for example, where the United States government knew who these individuals were in advance of the attack. They were already identified and known to the intelligence services. But despite the fact they were watching everybody in the country, they didn't thwart the attack. And the question is why? The answer there is because when you have individuals like me who are ultimately responsible for this, going into a desk every morning and trying to search through the world's communications from the previous day, the previous week, the previous month, you realize very quickly that if we collect everything, we understand nothing. And if we don't reallocate our resources in a targeted way, in a specified way, in a way that's based not on simply watching everybody without regard to guilt or innocence, but based only on a probable cause to interfere, to intrude into their privacy based on the expectation, an evidence-based approach, an articulable suspicion of criminal activity, we find that we're spending resources for no benefit in terms of public safety and a real cost in terms of freedom and liberty.
I mean, the picture that you paint is absolutely daunting, and I think anytime anybody hears you talk about it, it really brings these issues home as to why it really does matter. The problem is that it also sounds very complex, and it can be quite abstract, and it can feel very far away from ordinary people's lives when they are picking up their cell phone, when they are sending an email. They're not picturing an analyst on the other side actually reading that content. And in the questions that we had coming in on Twitter, a number of people raised this, and you've certainly heard the argument before, but for example, Immigrant 6 asking, some people think they're ordinary and they have nothing important for the government to look at, and why should they be bothered? And I do think that question is key to why in the UK especially, shifting this debate has been difficult.
It's a very important question. I'm glad you asked, because this is something that a lot of people struggle with when you're trying to talk to a friend about this, and they go, well, I don't care because I don't have anything to hide. I'm not doing anything wrong. First off, that's an argument about privilege. It's a misunderstanding of rights. You go, because of the fact that the right is not particularly valuable to you at a given time, because you are not threatening, you are not interesting, that it's not valuable for anybody. And also that it's not valuable for you, because you have no idea how the laws are likely to change in the future. You have no idea how the social norms are likely to change in the future. You could very likely find yourself in trouble, and regardless of whether you've done anything wrong or not, when the government knows everything about you, they can find something that you've done wrong, regardless of whether it was dangerous or destabilizing or anything like that. It's the famous Cardinal Richelieu quote, give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest man, and I'll find something in them with which to hang him. The problem is they don't have 6 lines anymore. They have 6 billion lines on all of us. But beyond that, let's presume that you don't have anything to hide. Let's presume you are sort of the least offensive, the least intimidating to the government type of person out there. They don't want to influence your industry. You're not in a union. You're not politically active. All you do is you go home and you watch TV. And you pay your taxes. That's also very important to them. If that were the case, you have to think about what it actually means when you change the paradigm there, because you as a citizen don't need to justify why you need a right. Rather, it's incumbent on the government to make a demonstration of why it is absolutely necessary to the public good to violate your rights. The burden of proof does not fall to you. And ultimately, when you think about the argument, you have to think about what they're trying to say and what it means. And when I look at it, it's no different to say, I don't care about the right to privacy because I have nothing to hide. That's no different than saying, I don't care about free speech because I have nothing to say. I don't care about freedom of the press because I have nothing to write. I don't care about freedom of association because I'm not involved with my community. I don't care about freedom of religion because I don't worship. But the problem is when you give up these fundamental freedoms, when you stop defending these general collective rights, you're actually shifting the character of democracy. When we think about the way that human rights work, they're not granted by governments. They're inherent to our nature. Government cannot simply say that, you can no longer speak, you can no longer express yourself. And the problem with this is the fact that if we allow them to do that, we have subordinated ourselves in a new way. We have given up a measure of power that once we have done that, we have stopped becoming citizens. And we have decreased ourselves into becoming subjects. Rather than becoming partner to government, we are subject to government. And that's a real danger, because once you go down that road, once the government claims a new power, once they plant a new flag in the domain of your rights, your liberty, your private life, within the 4 walls of your home, your private friendships, your private records, it's very difficult to get them to go back. And once you've lost a certain degree of power, then you can no longer oppose that power. There can be no revolutionary political movement when the government knows what everybody's doing, what everybody is saying, what everybody is thinking. And when we think about what that means, I think we have to be very careful about simply assuming that I, the individual, can give up the rights for the collective. The majority can't vote away the rights for the minority. And we cannot give up the foundation of all rights. And that's really what privacy is when you think about it. Privacy is not about hiding something. Privacy is about protecting something. Privacy is about protecting liberty. The right to privacy is what provides freedom of association. It's what provides freedom of speech. It's what provides freedom of the press, because you cannot decide what you think, what you feel, what you want to be, what you want to become, what you want to share, if you can't think about it in the first place, if you can't develop it, if you can't make mistakes with people you trust, with friends, and experiment and live in love. So when you think about the right to privacy, what you really need to think about is the right to liberty.
Ed, when you're talking about our, us as humans and those who are invading our rights, one of the things that I was really so struck by, looking through the documents, was that it used to be 10 years ago that here in Britain I should be most concerned about GCHQ, maybe, our domestic law enforcement, possibly. But now my communications flow right the way around the world, right? And so my right to privacy can be infringed by the French, by the Germans, by the Chinese, by the Americans, by anyone. Whatever route my communication takes, it could be the case that every email I send is intercepted by 6 different intelligence agencies. Now, when you think about it in that way, and then you try and reconcile that with how our legal frameworks are trying to deal with this problem, it seems to me we've still got a fundamental issue here. In Britain, our law says if you're inside the UK, you get some protections, and if you're out, fair game. In the US, it's a similar state of affairs. If you're a US person, you get your protections, and if you're outside, we don't care. How do we move from that, given that many of these agencies are there to collect foreign intelligence?
The first thing is we have to decide what the real nature of our right to privacy is. Not just what the right to privacy is, but what we want to protect, what we want to provide everyone on a human rights basis. Because when we try to lobby for reform in Britain, that's one thing. We try to do the same thing in the UK, that's another thing. If you try to do the same thing in Africa, if you try to do the same thing in Asia, if you try to do the same thing in all different corners of the world, you run into a very different dynamic, which is that national laws are not always responsive to public good. And when you think about mass surveillance and the fact that it's never prevented terrorist attack in the first place, you have to recognize these aren't public safety programs. These are spying programs. So is the cost to society, is the exposure that we all suffer as a result of leaving our communications insecure on the technical level worth whatever political or procedural benefit that they claim is valuable in our country, in our given countries? And so the question, how do we resolve this tension, is actually quite clear, and that's that we cannot stop with a simple assertion of law that this will be the operation in our own country. If, for example, the UK tomorrow, David Cameron wakes up and he decides, you know what, I'm a big fan of freedom now. I really care about people's individual liberties. And we all hold our breath waiting for that, and it happens. He reforms the law, everybody backs him. We have a renaissance of personal liberties in the United Kingdom. The problem is, as you say, as soon as you send your email, it goes all around the world into different regimes, into different legal structures that don't have the same laws. They don't recognize the same protections. They strip them away. What you have to do is find that thanks to advances in technology, we can now assert our rights through new means. We can use technical standards. We can use technical systems. We can use scientific advances and things like encryption and routing schemes, basically methods of encoding and protecting people's data across borders, so that when we improve things here, we don't just benefit those within our borders. We benefit everyone around the world.
Ed, you mentioned Cameron there. I mean, do you think that NSA is intercepting David Cameron's emails?
You know, this is actually a really interesting question, because there was a prominent congressman in the United States named Bernie Sanders, I believe he was the author of the letter, who wrote a letter to the director of the National Security Agency. And he said, are you intercepting the emails of Congress? Are you intercepting the emails of basically our government representatives? And the NSA director wrote back a very wordy reply that basically boiled down to, well, yes, of course, because we're intercepting everyone's. So yes, David Cameron's in the databases alongside everybody else. And if the National Security Agency, the director, decides that he wants to look at it, he can. And in fact, this is actually codified into the agreements that they have with each other, one of which, a top secret agreement, was published by The Guardian, I believe, which showed that not only were they sharing information back and forth between each other, which that rubber stamp court in the UK finally said actually was unlawful for the past 7 years, but it also said that this is not a binding legal agreement. The restrictions that they placed on each other, saying, well, we're not going to break your laws, you're not going to break our laws, said explicitly there's no legal force behind this. If you break it, we can't do anything about it. And then beyond that, at least for the United States version, but of course this is also the same for the UK and every other country that has a similar agreement, it has a section classified no foreign. No foreign being a spook speak, basically, for no foreign nationals. It means only the citizens of that country can view this clause of the agreement. And that clause said that if, for example, the National Security Agency considered it to be in the interests of the United States government, they would happily abrogate that agreement. They would happily basically search through David Cameron's email, listen to his cell phone calls, or anybody else in the UK, despite the fact that they had agreed not to do so. And they would have no obligation to inform the other party, and that other party would have no legal recourse even if it were discovered.
Sounds like a great friendship. So we've already taken a lot of your time. We've run over a little bit. I have one more question that I wanted to ask, just turning it a little bit more to you and a little bit about where you're at the moment. There's this incredible clip in Citizen 4, again, sorry for the spoiler, where you are just thinking about the fact that you're literally on the brink, and you've already taken the plunge at that point. And you say something like, you look quite white, actually, a bit like a ghost. And you turn around and you say, it's just weird to not know where I'll be tomorrow. And I wonder, do you still feel that way? Where do you hope to be in 5 years' time?
You know, I think the most liberating thing about sort of burning your life to the ground and becoming sort of an international fugitive, or at least that's what they claim, is that you no longer have to worry about tomorrow. You start thinking about today. And for me, that's been an incredible experience, and I'm actually quite grateful for it, because it's allowed me to look at life in a completely new way and focus on what I can't do, to think about what I can do, as opposed to what I might be able to do in 5 years or 3 years or 10 years or whatever, where I'm going to be. I have applied for asylum in 21 different countries across the world, including Western Europe. I'm still waiting on them to get back to me. But I have more hope today than I ever had before. And I wake up every morning with a smile on my face. And it's, I got to say, life is good.
So basically, international fugitive is the way to go. So alongside the hundreds of questions that we received on Twitter, I just wanted to let you know that we also received tens and tens and tens of people saying, just please thank Edward Snowden, because of course in the disclosures that you made affected the rights of every single one of us in this room, every single one of us listening online. We all have a debt of gratitude for the courage that you showed and the fact that we now have the knowledge to hold our governments to account on these issues. So I wanted to let you know that there was a kind of outpouring of solidarity, and that Amnesty International, as you already know, are working on your case, and we will continue to work on that. We'd like to see at least a few of those 21 countries offer you asylum, and we'd like to see a few of the other ones help you get across the world to the countries that would offer you asylum. But most importantly, of course, we want to see that the charges that are hanging over your head, that are wholly illegitimate charges and completely politically motivated, dropped, and that, if there's any vindication of your actions, it's this week with the legal reforms in the States, last month with the court ruling. The actions that you took as a whistleblower have directly led to huge changes, and that should be recognised. And Amnesty will continue to campaign on your case until we see you go wherever you want to go as a free man.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really don't know what to say. All I can say is thank you. Thank you so much for your support. And enjoy the movie.
Thank you so much. Great. So, wow, that was amazing. Just to sort of wrap up this section of the evening, we've obviously got a program that will continue. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody who is online. We're going to end the live stream at this point, but thank you for tuning in, and it was really wonderful that we had people all around the world watching. Next up, we are going to have the screening of Citizen 4, and we'll be hearing from Jess Search, who's the executive director of BritDoc, and they've been behind the incredible and powerful documentary made by